Let's talk about fantasy shows. Fantasy, as a genre, has existed as long as we've been telling stories. Mythology and fairy tales feeding into Tolkien and shaping what we usually think about as fantasy. In popular media, the Lord of the Rings adaptation has been considered the high watermark of the genre before the release of Game of Thrones changed that. Now, I'm not here to discuss or debate Lord of the Rings versus Game of Thrones. I'm just using this as an example to show that once Game of Thrones came to TV, we finally saw that medium hit the level of quality that you need to make some truly epic fantasy shows. Now, in the post-Game of Thrones world, we keep seeing more and more fantasy series being adapted for TV. Great. Except that when they're announced, news outlets often refer to them as the next Game of Thrones. I think that's weird and, well, impossible.
Yeah, okay.
And I want to dig into that. Let's do this. Alright, what up, Internet? First off, I want to talk about a bit of the history of fantasy as a genre on television, because I think the context of that would really help flesh out the points I'm trying to make here. I also won't be talking about animated series or shows aimed at children, because no matter how good they are, this is a serious topic for adults only. It's actually because I'm only trying to touch on things that I think are direct precursors to the topic at hand. The 60s through 70s had series like Bewitched and Dark Shadows, shows that took fantastical elements and merged them with sitcoms and soap operas as a way to spice up those genres and to tell stories that you wouldn't be able to tell without those elements. When we get to the 80s, fantasy isn't as big on TV, but it really came back hard in the 90s. Buffy and Charmed led the boom of contemporary fantasy TV, using fantasy in a modern setting, similar to novels like Neil Gaiman's The Ocean at the End of the Lane and the Dresden Files series. Buffy, Charmed, and their contemporaries struck a beautiful balance of serious, sometimes dark storytelling with campier elements to great success. Seriously, people need to stop acting like camp is a bad thing, because it's a lot of fun and a valid genre in and of itself. Things don't always have to be serious.
Why so serious?
The trend of modern set fantasy continued on to the 2000s with shows like Supernatural, skewing into the more serious but still fun tones, and True Blood, HBO's first foray into the genre, but not its last, obviously. Now at this point you might be thinking, none of this is classic high fantasy stuff, nothing that directly links to Game of Thrones, and I'm gonna say, stop yelling at your computer screen, dude. I honestly think that if you're actually yelling at your computer screen, you've gotta be a guy. The 90s also brought us what I call the Xenoverse, a bunch of sword and sorcery shows that were just super fun to watch and a good dose of camp. I swear this video isn't just about camp. You can see that Xenoverse style of TV in the more classically medieval series Merlin, loosely adapting Arthurian legend into a similar tone and style. Another example of this would be Legend of the Seeker, a series that, like Xena, was produced by Sam Raimi and his team. A big thing that all these shows have in common is that, by today's standards, they are cheap. And I don't mean that as an insult, because they did a hell of a lot with what they had, and should be praised for that. But the biggest divide between older shows and the current is that we are seeing networks put much bigger budgets into their fantasy productions. Okay, I can now, over 600 words in, finally start talking about Game of Thrones. This series is a turning point. There's no question about that. The production of Game of Thrones, even in its first season, was huge, and the budgets only continued to grow as the series went on. That's definitely why Game of Thrones gets compared to Lord of the Rings, because aside from them both being big fantasy epics, Game of Thrones lives in the same cinematic world as those movies. It's not TV, it's HBO. You know, no one ever talks about Legend of the Seeker comparatively to Lord of the Rings in any ways, and that's great because Terry Goodkind was a bad person. Like seriously, like a garbage guy. Game of Thrones instantly became the face of fantasy television. It was a huge hit. All those people called it fantasy for people who don't like fantasy. A bold claim for a show with ice zombies and dragons, but it really proved that the genre could be a big success and really leave its mark if you're willing to invest in it. And as Hollywood does, they chased that trend and decided to make more and more fantasy. Which is great if you're a fan like I am. But As the media does, the conversation became less about the influx of fantasy and the kind of stories that they can tell, and more about what will be, say it with me, the next Game of Thrones. I'm not going to talk about every series that has been at some point labeled the next Game of Thrones, because we can't be here all day. I'm mainly going to focus on The Wheel of Time and The Witcher, both recent shows. They've had at least one season come out relatively recently, and they're both shows that I've seen all of and more or less enjoyed thoroughly. The Wheel of Time is a take on the classic fantasy quest, at least at this point. That separates it from the political drama of Game of Thrones. The two don't have much in common in terms of story and style, except for the things Amazon have added to it. The series ages up the main cast, I assume to not have to deal with young actors aging at a different pace than the characters would in the books, but it also allows them to throw a few sex scenes in there. Nothing like all the stuff you see on HBO, but still, that's the closest thing I found to making it a child of Game of Thrones, so to speak. The Witcher leans closer to Game of Thrones, and not just because it has sexy naked bits. Both shows are grimdark series, filled with violence, gruesome deaths, and dense fantasy politics, but are also quite different. George R. R. Martin's Westeros is more or less medieval England, with a few fantastical changes, while the unnamed continent from The Witcher pulls from European folklore, especially in the monster department. And the monsters are part of the key difference. Thrones keeps its magic to the peripherals, especially in the early seasons. The Witcher is built with a society of sorcerers and a group of monster hunter scientists. Very different approaches to the genre. And while we're at it, The Wheel of Time is also a magic-heavy show. These shows are all unique, of course, and deserve to be looked at in their own light, without being constantly compared to one another. They shouldn't have to live in the shadow of what came before. And that also goes for the Carnival show, the YA one, and the Game of Thrones prequel that's coming out. Lastly, I think the idea of trying to find the next Game of Thrones is pointless, because there won't be another Game of Thrones. There will be other fantasy series, we could get great ones, maybe even greater than Game of Thrones, but we will never replicate what people really want, and that's the cultural impact. TV shows don't come out and aren't treated the same way now as they did when Game of Thrones first started. Something like The Witcher will come out, be the big thing for a while, everyone who's watching it will be talking about it like crazy, it's going to be the main focus for a while, and then it's going to slip into the background, until the hype for the next season starts, that is. And there's definitely hardcore fans that stay on board in between, but they aren't the majority. Game of Thrones was one of the last huge cultural landmarks, where everybody was talking about it all the time. The last of what I view as the golden age of television. Did I ever make that video I wanted to do on that subject? No. And that's why we'll never really get the next Game of Thrones. Between the way TV and how it's consumed and discussed has changed, and the fact that at least good adaptations of material aren't trying to replicate the tone and style of Game of Thrones, there really won't be anything like it again. Will we still get great fantasy stories and great fantasy adaptations? I sure hope so. But I think we need to let the phrase, the next Game of Thrones, die, because it's kind of just meaningless. That's it for the thoughts I've got on this one. Hope you enjoyed it. I got 2 more videos linked here if you want to check them out. I'd really appreciate if you gave us a like or a sub here, because it really helps the channel grow. Working on another nerdy thought piece for the next video. They'll be coming out in a couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. And until next time, have a good one.